We had some other recordings that we were working on. Actually, it was the live version of Coming Up.
If there's one member of the Beatles who had serious, long-standing issues with Yoko Ono, John Lennon's famously polarizing partner, it was Paul McCartney. From the moment Yoko began showing up in the studio, Paul reportedly bristled at her presence, even calling it workplace interference. The tension was undeniable, the creative chemistry disrupted. While the world moved on and many wrote it off as old band drama, Paul never fully let it go. So what really happened between them? And why, after all these years, has he still not forgiven her? Now, at 82, Paul McCartney is finally breaking his silence. In a confession that's as raw as it is revealing, he tells the world exactly why he never forgave Yoko Ono. And the truth might just rewrite everything you thought you knew about the Beatles' bitter breakup. Paul McCartney's rough childhood. James Paul McCartney came into the world on the 18th of June, 1942 at Walton Hospital in Liverpool, the very place where his mother, Mary Patricia Mohin, had once trained and worked as a nurse. She was tough, Irish, and determined. His dad, Jim McCartney, had Irish roots too, and a life full of stories, from music halls to cotton warehouses. Paul had a younger brother, Michael, and later a stepsister, Ruth, born during his dad's second marriage to Angie. While Mary was a devout Catholic and had Paul and Michael baptized accordingly, Jim, once a Protestant and later an agnostic, kept religion more in the background. The McCartney household wasn't exactly big on church, but love and music, those were abundant. Before the bombs fell, Jim had a decent gig as a cotton salesman, rising from humble beginnings as a sample boy at A. Haney & Company. When the war hit, so did Hard Times. Haney's closed, and Jim ended up working as a lathe turner at Napier's, a defense plant, pulling night shifts as a fireman. By 1944, the family moved into a flat in Knowsley, and 2 years later, into a council house in Speke. Mary's job as a midwife turned out to be the real breadwinner after the war, outpacing Jim's now downgraded cotton job. Little Paul started his school journey at Stockton Wood Road Primary in Speke, but transferred to Joseph Williams Junior School because Stockton was overcrowded. Smart as a whip, he passed the 11+ in 1953, one of just 3 out of 90, earning his place at the prestigious Liverpool Institute Grammar School. It was there, in 1954, that he met a younger lad named George Harrison on the bus. They clicked. Though Paul later admitted he sometimes talked down to George, he was a year younger after all, that bus ride sparked a lifelong bond. Thanks to Mary's steady income, the family upgraded to 20 Forthland Road in Allerton, a modest but proud home. Mary was always on the move, riding her bike through Liverpool's frozen streets to help deliver babies. Paul remembered her heading out at 3 a.m. with snow piled on the roads, a memory that clung to him like a frost. But everything changed on Halloween night in 1956. Paul was just 14 when Mary died from an embolism following breast cancer surgery. Her death left a scar on him. Years later, it would become a point of deep connection with John Lennon, who also lost his mother Julia in a tragic accident 2 years later. Jim McCartney wasn't just a working man, he was a jazz man. He led Jim Mack's jazz band back in the 1920s and filled the family home with music and the sound of an upright piano. He urged Paul to take piano lessons, but the boy preferred learning by ear. At age 11, he auditioned for the Liverpool Cathedral Choir. No dice. He settled instead into the choir at St. Barnabas Church in Mossley Hill. For his 14th birthday, Jim gifted him a shiny, nickel-plated trumpet. But as rock and roll took over the airwaves, especially from Radio Luxembourg, Paul longed to sing and play. So he swapped the trumpet for a 15-pound Framus Zenith acoustic guitar. Playing right-handed felt all wrong. Then he saw a poster of Slim Whitman playing left-handed, and everything clicked. Paul flipped the strings and made that guitar his own. He wrote his first song, I Lost My Little Girl, on that Zenith, and even composed an early version of When I'm 64 on the family piano. He was soaking up American rhythm and blues, but it was Little Richard who stole his heart, his hero, his fire. The first song Paul ever performed in public was Long Tall Sally, belted out in front of strangers at a Butlin's Filey holiday camp talent show. And just like that, the quiet boy from Speke had found his voice. The history of the Beatles. At 15, on the sunny afternoon of July 6, 1957, Paul McCartney wandered into the St. Peter's Church Hall Fete in Woolton, and walked straight into destiny. There on stage was John Lennon with his skiffle band, the Quarrymen, belting out a raw mix of rock and roll and bluesy folk rhythms. McCartney was intrigued. Not long after, the band invited him to join as rhythm guitarist. It wasn't just a new member they were gaining. It was the start of one of music's most legendary partnerships. By 1958, George Harrison, a quiet but skilled guitarist a year younger than Paul, joined the fold. Paul, at first, admitted to talking down to George, but their bond would prove unbreakable. Then came Stuart Sutcliffe, Lennon's friend from art school, who signed on as bassist. By 1960, the band were morphing through names like Johnny and the Moondogs, the Beatles, and the Silver Beatles. But it wasn't until August that they settled on the name that would shake the world: the Beatles. Right before heading to Hamburg for a gritty 5-show residency, they recruited drummer Pete Best. Hamburg was rough, but it sharpened their edges. The gigs were intense, the nights long, and their musical chops matured quickly. In 1961, Sutcliffe stepped away, and McCartney, either reluctantly or with quiet ambition, picked up the bass. That same year, the Beatles, billed as the Beat Brothers, laid down their first professional recording backing English singer Tony Sheridan on My Bonnie. That track caught the attention of Liverpool record store owner Brian Epstein. Captivated, Epstein became their manager in January 1962, giving the band their first dose of structure and polish. By August, Pete Best was out and Ringo Starr was in. Then in October, Love Me Do hit the airwaves. By 1963, the Beatles were superstars in the UK. By 1964, America was theirs. The world had never seen anything like it. Screaming fans, sold-out shows, and the term Beatlemania was born. Paul, with his boyish charm and wide eyes, was dubbed the cute Beatle. Though he was far more than a pretty face, he and Lennon became a powerhouse duo, writing early smashes like I Saw Her Standing There, She Loves You, I Want to Hold Your Hand, and Can't Buy Me Love. Their chemistry was electric, their styles complementary. Lennon's edge balanced by McCartney's melodic touch. In August 1965, McCartney broke the mold with Yesterday, a haunting ballad featuring just his voice and a string quartet. It was the first Beatles song with classical instrumentation, and the first recorded by a single member. Yesterday became one of the most covered songs in music history, cementing McCartney's place not just as a hitmaker, but as a serious composer. By the time the band started working on Rubber Soul later that year, McCartney's influence was growing. According to musicologist Ian MacDonald, Paul was no longer just a songwriter. He was emerging as the band's arranger, producer, and unofficial musical director. Critics hailed Rubber Soul as a leap forward in both sound and sophistication. McCartney recalled, "We'd had our cute period and now it was time to expand." But the sessions revealed cracks. Recording engineer Norman Smith saw it clearly. Tension between Lennon and McCartney and Paul becoming increasingly critical of George's playing. In 1966, Revolver took their evolution even further. Sonically bold, lyrically layered, and genre-defying. McCartney led the charge with Paperback Writer, the band's first A-side not rooted in love or romance. The promotional films for it and its B-side Rain were some of the earliest music videos, with Harrison later calling them the forerunners of videos. But it was Eleanor Rigby that stunned. With just Paul's voice and a string octet arranged by George Martin, the song was a dramatic shift, classical, mournful, and deeply modern. Music critic Jonathan Gould called it a neoclassical tour de force. By 1967, live performance was behind them, but McCartney refused to let the band drift. He pushed for a new concept, the Beatles as a fictional band, the alter egos behind Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. This reinvention allowed them to experiment wildly. As Paul said, "We were fed up with being the Beatles. We were not boys, we were men. We thought of ourselves as artists." The album became a cultural phenomenon, often hailed as rock's first concept album, and Paul, its primary architect. Then tragedy struck. Brian Epstein, their manager and steady hand, died suddenly in August 1967. With no one to steer the ship, McCartney stepped up as leader, but the shift wasn't smooth. His first major idea as de facto boss was the made-for-TV film Magical Mystery Tour. A chaotic shoot, mostly directed by Paul himself, it was a critical flop. the Beatles' first real misstep. Things only got worse in 1968. The band was falling apart during the making of the White Album. Personalities clashed, patience wore thin, and McCartney's perfectionism began to alienate the others. During the Let It Be sessions in early 1969, the friction was caught on camera. McCartney lecturing the band on discipline and direction, lamenting the loss of Epstein's guiding hand. Amid the turmoil, McCartney found solace in love. He married photographer Linda Eastman in March 1969, and that August they welcomed their first child, Mary, named in honor of Paul's late mother. Around the same time, the Beatles recorded what would be their final album, Abbey Road. Producer George Martin proposed a continuous musical suite. Paul loved the idea, but Lennon didn't. The compromise? A standard side one, and McCartney's envisioned medley on side two. Then, the world spun a bizarre rumor. Paul was dead, killed in a car crash in 1966, and replaced by a look-alike. It was nonsense, of course, but it exploded into a full-blown conspiracy. To silence it, Life magazine featured McCartney, Linda, and their family on its November cover, boldly stating, "Paul is still with us." Behind the scenes, however, the band was breaking apart. In September 1969, Lennon told the others he was leaving but agreed to keep it quiet while business deals played out. McCartney, already at odds with the rest over new manager Alan Klein, made it public in April 1970. It was a shock to the world, but for the band, it was the inevitable end. On New Year's Eve 1970, McCartney filed a lawsuit to dissolve the Beatles formally. A court-appointed receiver began untangling Apple Corp's financial web in March 1971. The Beatles' partnership was officially dissolved on January 9, 1975. Yet lawsuits and squabbles would flare up for years, echoing the fallout of a band whose creative chemistry had changed the course of music history. Through all the chaos, Paul McCartney never stopped. From a 15-year-old guitar prodigy in Liverpool to the driving force behind the Beatles' most ambitious moments, he wasn't just the cute Beatle. He was, in many ways, the anchor that held it all together until even he couldn't anymore. Paul's love life. During the whirlwind of Beatlemania, the Beatles weren't just rock stars, they were icons living under a microscope. Fans around the world swooned over the Fab Four, but none captured hearts quite like Paul McCartney. Charming, boyish, and immensely talented, McCartney was the poster boy for pop perfection. Girls lined the streets screaming his name, writing his initials on their notebooks, and dreaming of one day becoming Mrs. McCartney. But while the world fantasized, Paul was living his own complicated love story, one that would span 6 decades, include 3 marriages, countless muses, and more than a few heartbreaks. In 1959, before the Beatles were a household name, Paul McCartney fell for a local Liverpool girl named Dot Roan. Their young love took a serious turn when Roan became pregnant in 1960. They got engaged, briefly, but the relationship unraveled after she tragically miscarried. By 1962, their romance had run its course. McCartney would later admit that while he was with Dot, he wasn't exactly faithful, especially during the Beatles' wild early days in Hamburg, where temptation was everywhere. Girls were part of the atmosphere, and Paul, even engaged, was very much part of the scene. Before Dot, there were others too. The Beatles' early years were filled with close friendships and even closer entanglements. Paul dated Thelma Pickles, who had previously been involved with John Lennon. He also saw Iris Caldwell, George Harrison's ex. It wasn't uncommon for the lads to swap girlfriends now and then, especially before fame made such things a tabloid sensation. Enter Jane Asher, the it girl of swinging London. If Dot Roan was Paul's girl next door, Jane Asher was something else entirely. Glamorous, intelligent, and deeply entrenched in London's cultural elite. She met Paul in 1963 when she was just 17, working for a BBC music show that brought her backstage at a Beatles concert. The chemistry was immediate. Soon, Paul moved into the Asher family home in London, living in their sophisticated household and experiencing, as he put it, a homey, intellectual environment that deeply influenced his creativity. Their relationship lasted 5 years, through the height of Beatlemania. Jane, a rising actress starring in films like Alfie, Deep End, and The Mask of the Red Death, was poised and private. She never publicly dished about Paul, even when their romance unraveled. They got engaged in 1967, but fame, growing tensions, and Paul's increasing use of drugs strained their bond. The final blow came in 1968, when Jane discovered him cheating with American writer Francie Schwartz. With dignity, Jane announced their breakup on a BBC talk show. Schwartz later chronicled their affair in her 1972 book, Body Count. Despite the fallout, Jane left a lasting imprint on Paul's music. Songs like "And I Love Her," "You Won't See Me," "I'm Looking Through You," "What You're Doing," "For No One," and "Things We Said Today" were born from the highs and lows of their relationship. Paul later reflected that living with the Ashers offered stability and warmth during the madness, calling it kind of perfect. Linda Eastman, the great love of Paul's life. In 1967, fate introduced Paul to Linda Eastman, a talented American photographer, backstage at a Georgie Fame concert. They crossed paths again in New York, and by 1968, shortly after Paul's split with Jane, they were a couple. Linda wasn't just beautiful. She was artistic, strong-willed, and grounded. In 1969, they tied the knot in a modest ceremony at Marylebone Town Hall in London. Paul adopted Linda's daughter Heather from a previous marriage, and together they built a family of 5, including children Mary, Stella, and James. Unlike Paul's earlier loves, Linda wasn't content to stand on the sidelines. She became his creative partner, learning keyboards at his encouragement and performing with him as part of Wings. Their first and only duo album, Ram, dropped in 1971 before they fully launched Wings. Throughout the 70s, the couple retreated from the spotlight, often living at their remote Scottish farmhouse, far removed from the chaos of his Beatles past. Paul poured his heart into songs inspired by Linda, The Lovely Linda, Two of Us, My Love, and the eternal Maybe I'm Amazed. Their bond was legendary in its strength. Over the course of 3 decades, they were only apart for about a week, the time Paul spent in a Japanese jail in 1980 for marijuana possession. When Linda died of breast cancer in 1998 at the age of 56, Paul was devastated. He called her a beautiful, strong, unusual, amazingly talented woman, and often said he felt truly blessed to have shared his life with her. Grief-stricken but still yearning for connection, McCartney eventually found himself in the orbit of Heather Mills, a former model and outspoken activist who lost her leg in a traffic accident. They met at a charity event in 1999 and began dating the following year. In 2002, they were married in a lavish ceremony in Ireland. Paul, then in his 60s, was smitten again and even wrote songs about her, Heather, Too Much Rain, and See Your Sunshine. But the press weren't as enchanted. Mills, 26 years McCartney's junior, was constantly under scrutiny. Stories surfaced of inconsistencies in her past and her aggressive relationship with fame. They had one daughter together, Beatrice, who has largely stayed out of the spotlight. By 2006, it was over. Their divorce in 2008 became a public spectacle. Without a prenup, Heather initially asked for nearly $250 million, but walked away with $50 million after an acrimonious trial. The drama was tabloid gold. Heather allegedly insulted his daughter Stella, dumped water on Paul's lawyer, and painted herself as the wronged party. Paul, ever the gentleman, kept his focus on music. "It's been a difficult time," he said, "but music is a great healer. Music is therapy for me." If Heather was chaos, Nancy Shevell was calm. The pair met in 2007 while vacationing in the Hamptons, both owning homes nearby. Nancy, the elegant vice president of her family's transportation empire and a board member of New York's MTA, was private, grounded, and drama-free. In 2011, Paul and Nancy were married at the same registry office where he wed Linda over 4 decades earlier. Their romance has been refreshingly quiet. Paul, now in his 80s, often gushes about Nancy's strength and the balance she brings to his life. "I try to be helpful as a husband," he said. "I like to be the guy that lends strength. That's my role, to be the strength and the romance at the same time." The love song, My Valentine, was written with her in mind, a quiet ode to enduring affection. From Liverpool to the Hamptons, McCartney's love life has been anything but simple. He's been young and reckless, passionate and devoted, broken and rebuilt. Through it all, love, just like music, has remained a constant. And while millions once screamed for the cute Beatle, it's clear that Paul McCartney's most meaningful melodies have been shaped not by fantasy, but by the women who walked beside him through every verse of his remarkable life. Which brings us to Yoko Ono, the woman Paul McCartney couldn't bring himself to like. How did Yoko Ono disrupt everything the Beatles stood for? In the world of the Beatles, no figure is as polarizing or as debated as Yoko Ono, the woman who would eventually marry John Lennon but who first appeared at a moment when the band was already starting to fracture. The Beatles were dealing with loss, exhaustion, and rising tensions. Leadership was unclear, business was in flux, and personal identities were being tested. Into that delicate and unraveling world stepped Ono, and nothing would ever be the same. Ono first entered the Beatles' orbit in November 1966. She was a 33-year-old conceptual artist, known for her avant-garde installations and offbeat approach to art and life. Though based in New York, she had come to London and was hosting an exhibition at the Indica Gallery. John Lennon, then 26, attended a preview of her show more out of curiosity than interest. That meeting, strange, quiet, charged, would plant a seed that would grow into something much deeper. But their romance wouldn't bloom publicly until 1968. They married the following year, in March 1969. The space between that first gallery encounter and the day their love was declared was among the most tumultuous in Beatles history. By the end of 1966, the band had quit touring, worn thin by the madness of Beatlemania. Apple Records was being born, Lennon was spiraling deeper into drug use, and the group had begun following the spiritual path of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. But the most destabilizing blow came in August 1967, when their longtime manager and guiding force, Brian Epstein, died of an accidental drug overdose. His sudden absence left the band grieving. In the vacuum left by Epstein's death, Paul McCartney took it upon himself to become a kind of unofficial leader, trying to keep the band's projects and purpose afloat. Then came India. In February 1968, the Beatles went to Rishikesh to study transcendental meditation at the Maharishi's ashram. But Lennon, disillusioned with the guru and struggling internally, left early and returned to London. Not long after, he left his first wife, Cynthia, and began a relationship with Ono following the recording of their first experimental album, Unfinished Music No. 1, Two Virgins. Beatles historian Robert Rodriguez has said that Lennon was emotionally fragile at the time. John was spinning, he explained, coming off his heavy acid period, reeling from Epstein's death, and disheartened by India. According to Rodriguez, Lennon's vulnerability left him looking to fill an emotional void. He replaced one guru with another. McCartney, years later, in a 2012 interview, reflected on the appeal Ono had for Lennon. He said that part of her attraction was her unconventional worldview, which offered Lennon a whole new way of being. She showed him another way, he noted, and that proved irresistible to someone searching for a new identity beyond the Beatles. At first, Ono remained in the background, but gradually, Lennon began folding her into every part of his life, including the Beatles' sacred creative space. She was suddenly at recording sessions, speaking up, offering opinions, and even following Lennon into the bathroom. That breach of protocol didn't sit well with the others. No partner had ever had that level of access to Beatle territory. Rodriguez observed that by inviting Ono into the studio, Lennon disrupted the unspoken rules of the band. She became this joined-at-the-hip figure, he said. You can say Yoko broke up the Beatles, but it was John who brought her in. Ono would later clarify that even the most extreme moments of closeness were driven by Lennon. He made me, she once said, of always being by his side. Still, the other Beatles showed more patience than most people realize. McCartney, in particular, who was trying to hold the band together, made every effort to accommodate the new dynamic. Paul bent over backwards, Rodriguez noted, trying to be inclusive and diplomatic. Yet even with those efforts, friction was inevitable. Rodriguez believes Ono saw McCartney as her true rival, not just musically, but emotionally. During the White Album sessions in 1968, she reportedly brought a tape recorder into the studio and began narrating her thoughts about the band members. Her words about Paul were particularly telling. She apparently said that if he were a woman, she would be jealous of him. That line, Rodriguez explained, lays bare the triangle, John in the middle, between Paul and Yoko. And that competitive tension didn't fade with time. After Lennon's tragic death in 1980, Ono and McCartney still clashed, most notably over songwriting credits. McCartney wanted to correct some listings to reflect joint authorship more accurately, but Ono pushed back. Rodriguez remarked that she seemed determined to ensure that she remained Lennon's primary partner, even in death. "It's a love triangle," he said. "Complicated, unresolved, and emotional to the core." The Beatles officially ended in 1970, not with a press conference, but in the quiet lines of a press release written by McCartney to promote his solo album. He declared that his songwriting partnership with Lennon was over. That, more than anything, sealed the band's fate. Looking back, it's easy to cast Ono as the disruptive outsider, but the truth is far more layered. She arrived when Lennon was lost, at a moment when the Beatles were already faltering. In the end, Lennon made the choice, not just to bring her in, but to follow her lead. And that decision, whatever its impact, was one born not of sabotage, but of love. The real reason: Paul McCartney never forgave Yoko Ono. An author has shed new light on Yoko Ono's evolving relationship with Sir Paul McCartney, one that began with simmering resentment and biting tension, but gradually thawed into something more human and respectful. In his 2025 biography, Yoko, writer David Sheff dives into the tangled web between Paul, John Lennon, and the fiercely independent woman who would become John's wife and muse. Back in 1968, as the Beatles recorded the White Album, the band's dynamic was already under stress. Lennon insisted on bringing Yoko into the recording sessions, breaking an unspoken rule: no wives or girlfriends in the studio. McCartney, reflecting decades later on the McCartney: A Life in Lyrics podcast, admitted that none of them were particularly thrilled with Yoko's presence. According to Forbes, he even referred to her as an interference in the workplace. Many have long speculated that her constant proximity to Lennon contributed to the band's eventual split. Still, over time, the frosty tension between McCartney and Ono began to melt. Sheff writes that despite their rocky beginnings, marked by side glances and silent feuds, like the time Paul supposedly sang the line, "Get back to where you once belonged," while glaring at Yoko, there was eventual progress. Yoko and Paul had indeed come far in a relationship that had been contentious at the start, Sheff observed. In the early days of John and Yoko's romance, Paul confessed he simply hadn't liked her. But by then, John's mind was made up. He told Paul it was too late. The resentment, Sheff noted, had been brewing ever since. And yet, through the years, something softened. There had been many friendly visits, Sheff noted, and by the time Yoko was in her 80s, she and Paul were closer than they'd ever been. Their connection, Sheff wrote, had become genuine, not a mere show for the cameras. Still, their peace wasn't without flare-ups. After Lennon's tragic death in 1980, the issue of songwriting credits reignited tension. Paul's attempt to reverse the famous Lennon-McCartney billing to McCartney-Lennon was met with strong opposition. Ono, through her lawyer, told the Los Angeles Times that she believed Paul was damaging his own legacy by rewriting an agreement he and John had sealed decades earlier. "John's not here to argue," her attorney said. Eventually, Paul relented, embracing the iconic songwriting credit as a symbol of their partnership. In time, he publicly defended Ono, clearing her name in 2012 and later calling her badass in a 2013 Rolling Stone interview. A surprising tribute to a woman once seen as the Beatles' most unlikely adversary. Drug-related arrests. John Lennon may have worn the crown as the most controversial Beatle, but Paul McCartney certainly had his share of public missteps. While today he's mostly regarded with admiration and a sort of gentle reverence, there was a time when McCartney found himself squarely in the glare of scandal. That moment came on January 16, 1980, when McCartney landed at Tokyo's Narita International Airport. It was supposed to be the grand kickoff to an 11-city tour in Japan with his band, Wings, his first visit since the Beatles' 1966 tour. But instead of stage lights and screaming fans, Paul found himself behind bars. Customs officers discovered nearly half a pound of marijuana in his luggage. McCartney later told Japanese authorities that the stash was strictly for personal use. Still, the quantity raised eyebrows. It was enough to trigger serious smuggling charges and carried the threat of a 7-year prison sentence. Given Japan's no-nonsense stance on narcotics, the odds weren't exactly in McCartney's favor. A trial and jail time seemed entirely plausible. But after 9 days in the Tokyo Narcotics Detention Center, where he reportedly led sing-alongs for fellow inmates while fans waited outside, Paul was released and deported without ever setting foot in court. The decision to send him home rather than prosecute wasn't entirely shocking. A Beatle in jail was more than just a legal matter. It was a logistical headache. Authorities faced the uncomfortable reality that keeping him locked up might cause more disruption than it was worth. Still, one question lingered in the minds of fans and critics alike. What on earth was Paul thinking? Carrying that much weed into Japan, a country known for its strict customs checks, seemed at best wildly naive, especially since McCartney had been denied entry into the country just 5 years earlier due to previous drug offenses in Europe. Looking back 2 decades later, Paul speculated that part of him may have subconsciously been looking for a reason to dissolve Wings, which he did shortly after returning to England. But in a more candid moment in 2004, he offered a simpler truth. He said, "We were about to fly to Japan, and I knew I wouldn't be able to get anything to smoke over there. This stuff was too good to flush down the toilet, so I thought I'd take it with me." Though McCartney has remained on the public's good side these days, it's almost impossible to forget that at some point, McCartney was wild and unapologetic. Do you think Yoko Ono was one of the reasons the Beatles broke up? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the following video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.